Welcome to CivilNet. My guests today are Maria Pettersson and Gregory Poelzer. They are all the way from Luleå University of Technology in Sweden, specializing in mining. They are here in Armenia for a seminar on legal and political preconditions of mining at the American University of Armenia Center for Responsible Mining. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
So Sweden, first question. Sweden today is one of the largest producers of iron ore in Europe, with around 90% of Europe's iron and 5% of the world's iron reserves. How does the Swedish government regulate companies' activities in mining, and also how was that implemented?
Well, the government isn't exactly regulating it. It's regulated via law, and it's implemented through different permits, including the environmental permit. That's the very short answer.
But you can develop from
yeah, so there are numerous concessions, and then, like I said, finally the environmental permit to regulate the activity or to control the activity. Since it's considered environmentally hazardous, this is the way that we control all these activities. And the right and the ownership to the ore is regulated via the concession, which is more the civil law part of it. And the government has a say in whether or not the mine is actually allowed to start in some cases, but it's mostly this is carried out by different state authorities, control, both prior to the mine is established, but also in terms of supervision afterwards.
What kind of, so you talk about laws, what kind of laws are implemented exactly?
Yeah, yeah. We have the concession laws that regulates the exploration and exploitation permits for the mines. And so the actor can first get a permit to explore the land, and then a concession, that is a right to the minerals in question. But before they can start the activity, they also need an environmental permit. And in that permit, all the conditions for the activity in terms of pollution levels, precautionary measures and things like that are regulated and followed up on in by the supervision authority. And there is also, of course, an environmental impact assessment together with that environmental permit.
And as experts, would you say that the law that are implemented are full or are complete, or do they need some reforms again, or are there some lacks or things missing?
That's a good question. Most mines in Sweden today, we have 15 mines that are up and running, are not in full regulated in accordance with the new environmental code from 1999, because they were established a lot earlier. So, but when they seek additional permits or try to increase their productivity, that part of the activity is assessed in accordance with the new provisions. So I would say that most of the rules are in fact implemented today.
But could I just add, yeah, there are some discussions about whether the current legislation actually fulfills all the interests for people affected by mining. And so one of the recent changes that they made to the environmental code is they added, or in Chapter 6, they ensured that consultations during the mine development process actually happened earlier in the process, because there's a lot of stakeholders who felt that waiting until the environmental impact assessment took place was too far in the process to actually have a say in terms of how the mine development worked. And so there's questions like that that are still not completely solved in terms of what the mine development process should look like. Especially with regard to how to account for reindeer herder rights in Sweden. So I think there's still some work being done. I mean, it's always an open question in Sweden of whether or not the legislation fulfills the needs of society, but there's a lot of good mechanisms in place that making amendments to the legislation isn't too onerous, and they can do that.
Yeah, but I absolutely agree with you, but in as far as the current laws are applied in full, I mean, that is not to say that they are perfect.
No.
I mean, so you asked me if
so it's a dynamic change. It should be always.
I mean, there's in terms of what is necessary, the laws are not perfect. They need reform, and they recently been reformed, and they even from the beginning. But the question of whether the laws are followed, the actual laws that we have, I would say yes, most activities are run with modern permits when it comes to mines.
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, in terms of whether or not people follow the law, for sure. But the question whether or not the laws account for the current range of interests,
that is an open question.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
And it's something the government has acknowledged and will continues to acknowledge in the future.
Yeah.
To the communities?
Sure. One of the things that's happened in Sweden throughout its history is there's been a lot of work making sure that mining isn't done in isolation and that it is part of a bigger economy. And so one of the benefits or one of the draws that you could have for a mining company to be interested in that is if they know that they make initial investments into education, training, building better infrastructure, actually supporting the local economy and employment, the long-term benefits for them as a company becoming more efficient, more technologically advanced, increases the opportunity to be more profitable as a company. And that's something that's happened a lot in the Swedish context, especially where we're from, the university that we come from. We're quite integrated into the mining industry. And we provide a lot of support for the mining industry in terms of their technological needs. They have very practical questions that need to be addressed. Our engineering departments are extremely adept at doing that. And both on the social side, they have a lot of questions in terms of how to interact with different stakeholders, how to understand the law and work within the regulation. And we provide support for them in that respect too. But the key thing is they pay for a lot of that work, either directly or indirectly. So they're making investments as they're operating into the community directly, which helps support employment at the university and other training facilities. And so there's this, what you could say, almost like a circular type of economy within the mining industry in northern Sweden that helps facilitate a lot more employment than just mining wood all by itself. And that's critical because the company needs to see some benefit from it. And there's, for them, the investments that they made in terms of, at the university have paid off, I'm sure, quite a bit in terms of how efficient they've been at the mine.
Would you add something now?
Yeah, I mean, the talk about the risks with fly in, fly out is of course present also in Sweden, because what we're talking about here is, those are the old mines, big companies, but there have been interest shown by people that, where there have been some worries about this also being just an extractive business, and that is not looked upon as something that that the communities are really interested in.
So as far as I understand, in Sweden also the process is you use the raw material, you extract raw materials, then you process it to have a tool, an object, a part of something that you might export in Europe, worldwide, right? Yes. So can we say that this is the long-term future for mining and for ensuring jobs, long-term jobs, then rather than just extracting, exporting this raw material, and then one day there will be nothing else. There won't be any material on your ground, on your soil, and what do? It's just a short-term solution for jobs, right? So would you say that Armenia should go also with the process of processing, right?
If it is efficient and if you have the capacity, that could be a solution. In Sweden, there is a lot of interconnection between especially the iron ore mine and the steel production. And the quality of the ore is such that special steel can be made. which is in high demand. So there's a lot of interaction between those two different companies or products, and the same goes for the copper production. We have smelter companies that process that too. So if you have like I said, the capacity to use your own raw materials in an efficient way, I think that will strengthen the long-term use of these minerals, definitely.
Also, one of the problems in mining in Armenia is the ownership. It's 100% managed by private companies. What is the government's role in this? Is implementing high taxations, high taxes a solution? Or how does the Swedish government manage this ownership, as we talked?
So I think when it comes to how government deals with both publicly owned companies and private companies, you should have the same approach. It's important to have a very strong, strict regulation in place that's clear. Mining companies understand what their expectations are. And you shouldn't treat private companies or state-owned companies any differently, and that's the case in Sweden. And what the result has been is that private actors, in a lot of cases, actually act more progressively than the state-owned companies. They actually try to get ahead of wherever the legislation or where the regulators are, because they want to be as responsible and as efficient as possible. Because for them, that's what they want. They want as much predictability as possible, because if they have that, it's easier for them to conduct their operations. At the same time, Sweden has a fairly strong tax regime, as most people know, probably one of the strongest tax regimes in the world. So that's part of it, is knowing that if you have ore extraction in your country, there's going to be a significant benefit to the government income when it comes to using your natural resources or exploiting your natural resources. So I think you need both of those things in combination.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So the environmental impact is inevitable. We know that that mining creates air, soil, water pollution. Mining waste is very hard to clean up. How should governments rethink the environmental question in mining? Is restoration enough to decrease the impact, or should we think about something else?
First of all, I think that the polluter pays principle has to be the rule here, which means that when they start out their activity, all the costs associated with the mining business, the externalities in terms of pollution, waste, and everything has to be internalized into the company's own budget. And that can be done through the conditions of the permit. It can be done through setting aside financial means to clean up, to restore, and also during the operation phase of a mine, that you are sure that you are not causing more pollution. I mean, the environmental impacts of a mine are, like you say, they are inevitable. There will be environmental impacts. So the question is, how do we manage these impacts so that they are not becoming so severe that they threaten people's health or really destroy valuable areas? But the impact is irreversible. So I think that strict regulations are important, but flexibility is also important. The companies, they need to be able to negotiate not the level of protection, but how it's done. To make it cost effective for the companies, the rules, in Sweden we have a system that is based on a case-to-case assessment, in which the companies themselves, they can decide how they want to reach certain environmental targets, which makes them a lot freer in terms of how they use their own resources. But and when it comes to waste, there has to be a waste management plan in place from the beginning, and that has to be strictly followed and followed up upon. And, I mean, there are And of course, technology is very important. Using new technology, upgrading technology when it's when new technology is on the market. So that can also be part of the permit process. I think that's very important. Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Because for industry, performance-based targets are way more valuable than a lot, heavier regulation in terms of how to get there. And so, especially from the university we come from, where there's lots of engineering work going on, companies can now invest in a lot of research projects that look at how to deal with tailings, not in a traditional way, but in very innovative ways, where you can actually extract more minerals or resources out of the tailings that you have. You know you're going to produce them anyways, and instead of just trying to deal with it in an old way, why not find some innovative solutions so you can actually, get some revenue out of your tailings and still, live up to the environmental standards that the Swedish government has. So there's a lot of flexibility, and giving companies that flexibility is very valuable, and it works very well in Sweden because I know there's not hundreds, but there's been dozens of research projects at our university focused on just those types of issues.
It's very important for companies to keep their competitiveness while still operating under strict environmental conditions, and that is sort of the aim of this permitting process is to achieve that or accomplish that. And well, it hasn't been 100%, of course, but I think it's working pretty well.
Last question. What are other global success stories when it comes to mining in terms of long-term employment, economy?
Sure.
Yeah, there are many things to be said there, but one thing...
Mostly they're not really successful, right? Because mostly they're not really successful, right? When you take a worldwide, the mining sector is quite unsuccessful, let's say.
But I mean, in Sweden we have currently 15 mines, and that is not a lot. And the reason for that is partly that for a mine to open in Sweden, they have to show that there are mineral deposits that will last for 25 years. That is one of the prerequisites for the concession, which means that short-term they will never be allowed to operate. So they are at an early stage of this process. These are sort of sorted out. So that is one, which means that those that are up and running are economically viable, and therefore they're successful from an economical point of view. I would say that is one factor.
Yep.
You can.
I'm Canadian, so I'm going to use a bit of a Canadian example. So the province I'm from, Saskatchewan, there's what used to be a state-owned mining company, but is now publicly traded, called cometo. And they've done a lot of work working with Indigenous communities in terms of how to develop the industry in northern Saskatchewan. So some of the things that they've come up with is ensuring that employment stays local. So they're one of the largest Indigenous employers in the entire country. Almost half of their workforce is Indigenous and from local communities. So that's in terms of long-term economic development for communities that wouldn't really have those opportunities. They've been relatively or fairly successful on that front. Another area is in terms of environmental assessment and evaluation. So what they've come up with is boards that are a mixture of community members and experts and people from company that do a lot of the environmental monitoring for all of their operations. The important part of that relationship is that you have a lot more local knowledge of how the environment works and what the dangers are, how to mitigate risk and solve problems. And so it's new ideas or thinking about how to interact with the communities in a different way to solve very practical problems. They're common across all mines, but some of those success stories that I think should be shared a lot more, because the mining industry, yes, there's a lot of problems with it, of course, and people are well aware of that. But there's a lot of good stories that need to be shared a little bit more and learned from to not just prevent the current problems, but solve problems from the past as well.
But just, isn't that a problem, again, related to the gap between Western countries and other, let's say, southern countries where they're supposed to be in the development process, right? Yeah. The countries more, let's say, developed have tendency to ensure and to regulate their country, their soil, their lands, their communities, while other countries, such as India, let's say, or even in some way Armenia, right, don't have all those regulations because they are still developing countries. So this is a gap between, again, developed and underdeveloped.
Of course, there's a gap. But there's also, that means there's the opportunity to change things and change things in a significant way. Obviously, that's not going to happen overnight. Completely changing how your institutions operate and everything like that just doesn't happen immediately. But I think, in a way, mining actually presents an opportunity to start bridging the gap because you can have a lot more local input, build trust between communities and companies, and actually find solutions that work within the framework of government to help start building that local capacity, the social capital that you need to build trust between these different actors in order to solve these problems. Because that's what it's going to take. Because back to the Saskatchewan example, there was a huge lack of trust. There was huge institutional gaps. The regulations at the provincial level may have been okay 50 years ago, but they weren't fantastic. And local communities had huge problems with how industry conducted itself. But what it took was a combination of, everyone giving up a bit of compromise from all parties in order to find a solution that everyone could benefit in the long term. And I think that's the other thing that people have to think about. Mines are a long-term project. You can't, if you expect things to go on for a long time, you have to build a relationship from the very beginning that's going to work in order for the entire project to work. And when these companies were operating in northern Saskatchewan, they realized we actually have to build strong relationships with the local communities if we're going to have any chance of having successful operations here. Because the alternative is, if you don't do that, then you have protests, blockades, and the cost of doing operations just aren't worth it anymore. And so once companies begin to realize that, then there's the opportunity to say, okay, we're not going to just do whatever we want now, we're going to actually start listening a little bit. We'll need government's help to start facilitating these relationships, help develop a legislative framework that works for both parties, and then we can start moving forward with how to do this in a much more sustainable or responsible way.
Thank you, Maria and Gregory. Thank you, Maria and Gregory, for this talk. Thank you for watching and continue to follow CivilNet.